This is our annual meeting, and I'll call that to order. Part of the annual meeting consists of two parts. One is a budget hearing, which we'll hear from our business manager, Andy Weiland, about the budget. And then the second meeting is the annual meeting portion of it, where we will consider adopting a tax levy and doing several other matters. There should be agenda at the table if anybody needs those. That would include ground rules with that. And there are sample motions with that. I'd like to introduce several members of the Board of Education that are present tonight. Krista Flanagan is the clerk. Troy Pankratz is treasurer. Anna Bijak. And is Heather here yet? Do not see Heather. Kevin is overseas and will not be here tonight. And Tim, I think, is joining us online. Tim LeBrun. He's out west. Hi, Tim. Welcome. Can you hear us okay? Very good. And I don't think I've missed any of the board members, have I? Good. Okay. That takes us into the first part of the meeting, which is the budget hearing. I want to advise the members of the electors of the Oregon School District that our books have been audited by Johnson & Block and Company, and the board will receive that, I think, sometime later this year. Okay. And we'll get that at a regularly scheduled meeting. And now we'll enter into the financial report of the district from Andy Weiland, which will constitute our budget hearing. So Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Zock. So before we start getting into the budget for this next year, what we like to do is just kind of recap what happened for the last year. So we'll do that real quickly. If the clicker works. There we go. Except I think I'm going the wrong way. I apologize. All right, here we go. So one of the things we like to do is like to compare budget to actuals. That way we can kind of get an idea of how well we're doing on a projection basis. So we'll see on this slide that the original budget was about $53.5 million on the expenditures on the revenue side. Actual came in about $53,100,000. The difference was $436,000. That can be attributed very simply to not selling the school construction house until actually it was sold in, I believe, the end of August. So had that sale happened before July 1st, we would have actually exceeded our revenue a slight percentage, but as it is, it was less than 1% off. On the expenditure side, we were off quite a bit more. That's completely attributed to what happened on March 13th and kind of stopping operations. We had some savings related to transportation, cleaning, those types of things, utilities significant, and we actually saved $3.4 million. Now, some of that savings was attributed to what we call carryover on a school year basis, and I'll get into that later on, but basically of that $3.4 million, about a little over $1.5 million was attributed to savings, to basically slowing down operations at the end of the school year, and the other part was related to the carryover. So now we'll compare budget, sorry about that, clicker's moving a little fast on me. We'll compare budget and the original budget from October. That's when we approve the official budget. So tonight we're having a hearing. We come back in October and approve the budget, and it's called the original budget. And our revenues at that time were projected at $53.5 million. The expenditures were a little bit higher, and that's because we were allowing carryover funds from prior balances that we hadn't expended, and so we were bringing them forward in order to possibly expend them. We did not expend them, so they carried over for another year. But the projected fund balance was decrease was $1.4 million reduction. What actually happened was we actually underspent, as I mentioned before, about $1.5 million. So our fund balance increased. And we had several discussions with the Board of Education on that. That was going to be part of our strategy in order to work through this school year related to COVID-19 and how we were going to have to expend some extra funds related to instructional computing as well as other expenses to keep things operational. So I've been talking about carryover dollars. Another way we designate those is called assigned fund balance. So of that almost $3 million, I'll show you a quick capture of that amount of money. Some of it was related to school budgets, not expending all their funds. About $300,000 related to that. Departmental carryover was almost $400,000. A lot of that was related to a couple things. One was a playground allowance or allocation that the Board of Education had allocated several years ago that we're actually getting ready to take advantage of and utilize this year. And the other of it was related to something in the technology education area of our school district. The state actually, if students complete certain certifications, they give us funds as a reward, and we've been accumulating those dollars for purposes related to vocational education. And so they were over $100,000, as well as the playground allocation was close to $100,000. So that makes up the majority of that. And then there's other smaller balances that are out there as well. Director of Instruction was over $130,000 that was carried over. And then the Oregon Education Association compensation system, which as we were implementing the compensation system, we didn't spend those funds. That's allocated and sitting there as we needed as well. And then as the board basically approved or directed us, we carried over the $1.5 million in unspent funds for COVID expenses this year. So school funding is built into a fund arrangement. So we're going to go through a couple different funds. The funds that I was just talking about before is our main fund, our general education fund. This is a referendum approved debt fund. So this fund is specifically for referendum that were approved and makes basically bond payments to pay for those bonds, those proceeds that we use to invest in our schools. So the room that we are involved in here right now is related to the 2015 school improvements. You see that there's a bond payment for this in this fall that we have to pay. And then the 2018 referendum related to Forest Edge construction, as well as new land improvements land that we purchased, has a payment as well. You add those up, they basically account for a little over $1.5 million, and we had $1.6 million there, so we have enough money to pay for that. That's a requirement of the state to make sure that we have enough money to basically pay those payments. So we still have $111,000 left over at that time for future payments. Fund 38, same thing. This is our non-referendum debt fund. The main thing, the only thing left over in this fund at this point is a refinance of our unfunded liability for WRS that we did probably about 18 years ago, 19 years ago almost. And so, again, we have assets associated with being able to make that payment on 9/1, which actually already happened, and enough money for future payments as well. The proceeds that I mentioned before that we were using those bond monies to pay for are related to those proceeds for the 2014 referendum. We finally spent those all, so we have $0 amounts left in that. And then the 2018 referendum, we still do have some proceeds. We've spent the majority of that $6.4 million already. Most of it is related to the Forest Edge school construction. And we are still continuing making payments as we get that building operational and deal with the punch list and those types of things. We also are purchasing the forest at the land behind Forest Edge, the woods, Worth Woods. That will happen actually on Wednesday. So about $450,000 will be leaving our bank account at that time, and we'll be closing on that property on this Wednesday. Food Services Fund. This is a fund that's got some things going on. So typically we've had about a $200,000 to $300,000 fund balance in that fund. We brought in about $1.276 million last year, and then our revenues slowed down considerably once March 13th happened. We basically had expenditures of $1.5 million. So you can see we didn't have enough revenue to compensate for our expenditures. So we basically utilized the entire fund balance, as well as we actually had to bring in $7,600 from Fund 10, because by law, the food service balance cannot have a negative balance. And you can see that we had some capital expenditures there. We broke those out, but basically the fund balance at the end of last fiscal year was 0. Community Services Fund. This pays for things related to community service in the district. So the pool is a significant part of that. Performing Arts Center is another part of that. And then our programming that comes out of the district office that Amy Miller directs is also a significant part of those. Those are the kind of the three-legged stool of community ed for our district. We had revenues of about $728,000 and expenditures of just about $700,000. So we did have a little bit of a balance, partially because our programming couldn't continue once COVID struck. So community ed is another budget or another fund that has to have a 0 budget at the end of the next year. So we will be under levying by the $29,000 for 2021. OPEB Liability Employee Trust. BPI sees this as one fund, but we've broken it out traditionally as 2. It has 2 distinct purposes and actually 2 bank accounts. One is related to other post-employment benefits. These are benefits that our employees have the ability to access once they retire. And we've kind of capped that. There are only certain people that are eligible for that at this point in time, grandfathered those folks. And then we have the Employee Trust Fund, which is an allowance or a conversion that happens with sick leave for employees that can convert it into either a 403B program or in this case, a trust for health insurance purposes. So the 2 funds combined had revenues of about $1,076,000, expenditures of $779,000. So the fund increased by about $316,000, and we have total equity of about $5,153,000. We are required by law to talk about investment returns. This fund is supposed to grow, and so we brought in about $68,000 in interest revenues. By policy, I manage those investment revenues. We are very, very conservative with those and keep them very, very well safe. We don't invest in anything of any significant risk of the principal. So to break down OPEB a little bit further, you can see our contributions for the last 4 years. Implicit rate subsidy is an interesting concept. The concept is that as people get older, they cost more to take care of. And so the Governmental Accounting Standards Bureau requires us to identify an implicit rate that older folks cost more than the normal school employee population. And so we have to identify that, but it goes in and it comes out, so it doesn't really change the cash flow associated with the fund. And then we show payments of benefits, which is to the health insurance provider, and the fund balance. And you can see the fund balance steadily increasing. The reason that there's a number down below, it was July 2015, June 2017, and June 2019, is because there's a study that's required by GASB every 2 years for the size of our district that identifies what kind of liability is out there for that promise of health insurance benefits after people retire. And you can see that benefit, the liability, the net liability is decreasing. That's mostly because our assets have been increasing. So we've been putting more money into that fund to make sure that we have proper assets to pay for those liabilities over time. And so the liability, the net OPEB liability has been decreasing. You see that we don't have a number necessarily on the right-hand side for 2020 because we're on the off year right now. But if we were to estimate that, we would anticipate having a net liability of about $2.6 million, which is the $300,000 that we put into additional assets this 1 year. So here's a breakdown between the two, the employee trust. The trust is simply the monies that go in for an employee related to their sick leave conversion amounts. And then depending on whether there's more people that draw money out of that or more money that is deposited into that has the impact each year. You'll see that last year there was actually a negative $7,200 or $7,300 reduction. That's simply because more money came out than went in. It's nothing to be worried about. The OPEB, you'll see the additional $324,000. That was related to additional contributions to put assets aside for the purposes of paying that liability. We are required to put more money in than just the actual cash flow. What that allows us to do is basically compensate for categorical aid for special education employees and be able to get categorical aid for that contribution. If we didn't put, I believe, 5% over the required amount, then we would actually not be able to take advantage of that categorical aid. All right, so that is a quick rundown of our fund balance for each of the funds within the school district. Does anybody have any quick questions or immediate questions related to how we did last year? Hopefully that's not of a surprise to anybody that's been following this. All right, I will get into the preliminary budget now. Preliminary budget, we actually talked about last board meeting. It was in the Oregon Observer this last week for people to look at. We present it each year at this time, and then as additional information comes to us in basically the month of October, end of September, October, we refine the budget. It won't be off by much, but it always is revised a slight amount of money. So the Board of Education will consider that in the last meeting in October. Here's some of our enrollment, our revenue projections. Enrollment is a significant amount, it's the driver of our budget. For the vast majority, over 80% of our budget is driven by how many students we have. So that estimate is always important. We also have, for the state budget, a $170 increase per base member for our revenue limit. Our revenue limit is also what drives our budget. We get categorical aid per student of $742. And our July 1st general aid estimate is what we use. The state is required to give us an aid estimate in July. That basically helps us determine or project what our tax levy is going to be. That will become certified on October 15th, and that will allow us to set our levy at the end of October. Significant increase in the budget, state budget this last year was related to special education categorical aid. So that as we spend funds for special education students, basically salary and benefits of our staff members, we are reimbursed a certain percentage. That percentage has been decreasing. When I came about 20-some years ago, it was in the 30s. It was down to low 20s, and this last state budget, the legislature actually did increase that up to 29.5%, which is a significant impact to our budget. Equalization, equalized value, the equalized assessed value is simply a calculation that we need to use in order to create our levy rate, and we're projecting that assessed value increase to 5% this next year, or this year. Actually, we should know that number in the next couple days. Revenue by source, so this just gives you a feel for it. For the most part, I call our family here, the school district, kind of a two-income family. We get money from property taxes and equalization aid. In the past, they've been more equal, but I would say that the legislature has kind of changed and stopped funding until recently equalization aid and put more money into what's called the per pupil aid, which is just a categorical aid, a certain dollar amount, as I was talking about before, that we get for each student. So if you were to add the per pupil aid to equalization aid, you'd see that we were pretty darn close. We'd be at 42% compared to 43% of the property taxes. All the other revenues make up a fairly small amount. I will point to, just had something pop up here. Open enrollment is a significant amount of our revenue system too. So the open enrollment is about 5%, and that's net open enrollment. So we are a net increased school district. We have more students come to us than leave us. Usually about 300 come in to about 100 leave. Major revenues, as I mentioned before, 80% of the school district revenues come from property tax and equalization aid. You can get up to 85% if you add the categorical aid. And the main drivers of those are our 3-year average of student counts. You'll see that we are anticipating an increase of about 26 students this year in our 3-year average. That's been systematically kind of revised as we went through the summer, as we got more and more data. And then the $179, which is state law right now for our increase. Per pupil aid, that's the categorical aid. This last budget, there was no additional increase put into that in the state budget. It all went into the revenue limit. And then open enrollment, those dollars are set by the state. And so we saw an increase of open enrollment of $354 for regular education students and $254 for special ed. So if we were to kind of look at our new revenues and what the main drivers were in our school budget, revenue limit makes up $2.7 million of our new budget. Of that, the majority, $1.7 million, is related to a recurring referendum that was approved in November of 2018, specifically to run the new Forest Edge Elementary School. Both staff it as well as provide utilities and all the things associated with that. Open enrollment, we had budgeted an additional $205,000 related to that. As we were going through summer, we opened up more seats because we saw that we were going to have some need for additional funding this year. Special education categorical aid, that was, as I mentioned before, significant. We went from 25.5%. The first year of the budget actually went up a little bit. I think it was about 1%. So before that, we were under 25. And then we went, we're projected to go up to 29.5 this year. The CARES Act is a federal program that was approved related to COVID-19, and we have a one-time revenue of almost $100,000 for that. We did lose some revenues in our budget related to Medicaid. Again, when March happened, we were not able to serve as many students in that program as normal. Rental fees obviously went off because our facilities were closed. And then interest rates, anybody that has a savings account knows that interest rates are significantly lower than where they have been in the last couple of years. So when we do all the calculations and we try to estimate what percentage comes from where, the pie chart kind of showed this before. Equalization aid, and I was going to update this. The top line should say 2021. I thought actually I did update it. But it's going down a little bit, equalization aid being 46%, property tax being about 54%. Part of that's related to the equalization aid formula, which is kind of a Robin Hood formula. As you become more property tax assessed value rich, quote unquote, you lower the amount of money that you get in state aid. So that's a concept related to our school funding formula in Wisconsin. And we are at a point where our property wealth is such that we're in something called negative tertiary aid, where when we spend an extra dollar, we lose a little bit of money in the state aid formula. So how do we spend our money? So this basically gives a good feel for that. About 60% is spent on instructional purposes. 15% is spent on instructional support. That could be anything from libraries to nurses to counselors. Administrative support is 8%, maintenance and operation 9%, transportation 4%, and then we get into kind of some smaller things that are out there. We also look at the same expenditures a different way. So before it was by purpose, now it's by type. So what are these things that we're spending money on? Shouldn't be a surprise to most people that the majority of our funds are spent on people. Salary makes up almost 56% and benefits makes up 20%. So we're basically around 76% in just people. And then we have purchase services, which is 15.5%. We do contracted services here in the school district in Oregon. So we don't own our own, for instance, transportation. We work with contractors and have for over 30, 40 years that actually are folks that live in Oregon, unique in that way. And then our night cleaning is significantly contracted out as well. So had those two things been in the Oregon School District, you'd see a higher percentage of salary and benefits, but because we contracted out, the purchase service number is a little bit higher than waivers that would do that. Non-capital objects, 3.3, capital object, 3%, and everything else is fairly insignificant. So trying to add all the operational funds together, these are funds that are under the revenue limit. Operational revenue budget is about 56.7 million. Our expenditure budget is 59. Again, the reason that that's unbalanced a little bit is that we have these carryover funds that are in fund balance that are assigned for the purpose of certain things that we are showing would be spent this year. Question of whether they will be spent or not is always up in the air. Depends on those people managing those funds and whether they will be spent. We also are showing a transfer to Fund 50, that's our food service budget. Because we are continuing food service operations, yet we aren't in session, our food service operation is not able to basically cover its expenses. So we will be moving some money, some one-time funds in order to help that. I do have an update for the board on that, and I can tell you that some changes that the federal government made related to how we deliver or how we're able to work our food service program has significantly increased the number of meals that we're serving. We're serving about 1,800 meals a day right now. That's significantly more than the couple hundred that we were selling in the summer, and even more than about 100 and some that we were selling in the spring. So we anticipate that 655 going down, and we will be revising that for the original budget, thinking that it might be in the 455 area. It could be even better, but right now the USDA folks are telling us that they're only allowing the program to operate the way it is, which is very popular, until December 31st. So at that point in time, we'll be switching operational mode again, and unfortunately the food service program will not be quite as financially viable as it is right now. So a decrease in fund balance of about almost $3 million. Our carryover is about $3 million, and non-referendum debt is just a little bit of a rounding area, and it's included because it's part of the operational budget. So basically, we are looking at a balanced budget if you take those things out of the play. So our debt payments, this is just a real quick snapshot of our debt. You can see that it's very, very stable over the next 20 or probably 18 years or so, from 2020 to 2038. It's right around $6,350,000 to $300,000. Food service, we've mentioned this before. Again, this will be revised. Our revenues will probably be closer to, at least for half the year, will be closer to $500,000 rather than the $300,000. Our transfer will go down by about $200,000, and our expenditures are should still be right around $1 million. And our hope is then that we again be around a zero ending balance. Down the road, when we're out of this environment that we're in right now, our hope is we'll be able to build the food service balance back up to something that allows us to invest in equipment and those types of things. You can see that one note is we did increase lunch prices by 0.5 cent. That would come into play in January when we're outside the USDA program that's currently operating. I'd be much faster if the clicker was quicker. Capital projects funds. So these are the funds related to the capital projects that we've been working on since 2018 for the new construction at Forest Edge and some of the land purchases that we've talked about. You can see that we're going to bring in a little bit more revenue. The main revenue there is a federal E-rate funding for a fiber project that we put in the ground between high school, Netherwood Knoll, and the new school. So we anticipate right around $400,000, I believe, in revenue there, as well as we have some grants from Focus on Energy related to the energy efficiencies of the new school. So we do anticipate spending the majority of that money, but we do anticipate having a balance left because we have one more fiber project to connect to Muffin, which is the Madison Unified Fiber Network, next summer. So that's what that 250 will pay for. Employee trust funds, again, I've kind of mentioned this real quick, so I'm going to be fast. It's two different components to it, one for OPEB, one for the sick leave conversion employee trust funds. It's budgeted to decrease a little bit. That's an estimate on how employees that have retired will utilize those benefits. It will be whatever the employees utilize. And then the OPEB fund is designed to increase balance so that we can compensate for that liability and eventually perhaps not have a liability. And then community education, pretty much our last fund, although there's one more that I'll mention real briefly in a second. Jumping into the three main categories are pool, performing arts, and then our outreach, which is basically the booklet of programs that we have. The last thing we have is community building use security. So when we were in operations, we would budget or have budgeted additional funding to have somebody go and make sure that the buildings are being used appropriately. We are a very open district typically, except in this situation. So that's a budget that's out there as well. That probably will go underutilized or unused. This is a statement that we have to say by law, what the purposes of community education are. I won't read it to you, but basically it's for the pool, it's for performing arts, athletic programs for youth, those types of things is what it's used for. Tax levy calculation has several components. Operational levy, that's basically Fund 10 for the most part. Non-referendum debt, that's the unfunded liability that I mentioned a little while ago. Referendum approved debt, that's for the 2014 and 2018 referendums. And then community services for the pool, performing arts, and the community programming that we're still trying to do in a virtual sense. So if you add those all up, we're at just over $31 million for this next year. So how does that compare historically? The levy rate is actually a little bit less than what it was a couple years ago, but up from last year and the year before. Specifically, what's driving that is the referendum override, which the voters of the school district approved in 2018. The bond payments actually have been included in the levy since 2018. This is the first year that the override's in place because we didn't have a building to run until now. So it was designed to happen at this year. So you'll see with an EAV growth of 5%, which I think is marginally conservative. It may be over that. Like I said, we'll find that out in the next couple days. The mill rate is anticipated to be about 11.52. It could be slightly less than that when we have the certified aid and the EAV. So here's just kind of a quick graph of where that's been over the last several years. The bottom shows the equalization aid dollar amount in the yellow, operating property taxes, the levy, and then the equalization value on the other side of it is the orange. So all funds, if we were to add up all our budgets together, you can see those right here at about $66 million. And then I think we're going to be getting to my favorite sheet, which kind of shows, and here's the expenditure side of that, $75 million. Not something to be overly concerned about. Usually people might say, well, wait a minute, you only have so much money in and you've got more money going out. The main driver here is the capital projects funds, which is the referendum that we're completing at Forest Edge. And then the assigned fund balances from prior years. So, fund summary, I apologize, this is small print, but this shows you each of the funds that we have in the district, kind of where they started on 7/1/2020, what revenue that they're going to be bringing in, the expenditures that are anticipated, and then any transfers. The main two transfers are as follows. Special education fund, we haven't spoken a lot about that. It's kind of included in the operating funds. It's not specifically designed to operate it by itself, but DPI requires us to break it out separately. So it does bring in a little bit of money, about $3.4 million anticipated, but it spends close to $9 million, and so the difference has to be made up someplace, and that's a transfer from the general fund. So you'll see at the end, it's projected to have a 0. That transfer basically will deviate based on what the expenditures are. And if the expenditures are larger, the transfer will be larger. If the expenditures are less, they'll be less. In the end, that fund will have a 0 balance at the end. All the other funds we've mentioned for the most part. Sorry. And you can kind of see where they all are. The largest other big negative, I'll just mention again, is the referendum, or the capital construction projects, the $6.185 million. Most of that is already actually spent. It's related to the Forest Ed construction. The only fund that I didn't mention is called the Cooperative Purchases Fund, Fund 99. That's a federal program that we run with multiple school districts, and it's related to vocational education. And I think the Badger Conference, athletic conference, is actually run out of there as well. With that said, are there any questions related to the budget for 2021? All right, thank you. Oh, one more? Somebody kept trying to move me along. Oh, okay.
Thank you, Andy. Actually, the development of the budget for the 2020-2021 school year began earlier this year and was the subject of a long discussion at our last board meeting, where the board adopted a preliminary budget in anticipation for the annual meeting to approve the levy tonight, and then the final budget will be presented to the board in the last meeting of October. So it's a long work, and Andy, thank you for all your efforts in presenting that to us. Okay, that will close out the budget hearing portion of the meeting, and we will move to the annual meeting. And I call that to the order at this point in time. The first order of business at the annual meeting is to appoint a chairperson. I'd entertain nomination for chair of the annual meeting.
I'll nominate Steve Zoff as chair of the annual meeting.
Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Are there any nominations? Hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to appoint me as chair for the meeting and to, by unanimous consent.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Katie, you got those? Okay, any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Second order of business is to appoint a parliamentarian, and I will appoint Gina Jonan. Gina, do you accept the role of parliamentarian tonight? Virtually? Good to see you.
Okay.
We've got a packet of materials. The first item in the packet of materials that we'll need to approve is the ground rules, which are on the white sheet. Not going to read those, but I'd entertain a motion to adopt the ground rules as set forth on the sheet.
I'll make a motion to approve the ground rules.
Anna Bijak with
Motion, is there a second?
I'll second that motion.
Kristen Flanagan with the second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ground rules are adopted. Next item on the annual meeting agenda is to adopt the minutes of the last meeting. The Wisconsin Association of School Boards has provided advice that we do not have to read these and approve them at the meeting because the members of the audience tonight are not necessarily the same members as were here last year, but those are printed for everybody's information and available to you. That takes us to the next item on the annual meeting, and that's the Superintendent's State of the District report. And I'll welcome to the podium for the first time our Superintendent, Dr. Leslie Bergstrom, to give a report on the district.
Thank you, Katie. You're going to have to put forward the slide. What page?
Good?
Oh, you're going to have to put forward. We're going to 9, but not up on the screen for us to see. So use the phone. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here this evening. We'll start off, it's a very crowded podium, by the way. We'll start off by looking at our mission and knowing that that's where we always begin. We're grounded in our mission. We're focused on helping students acquire the skills, the knowledge, the attitudes to achieve their individual potential. That is why we exist. It's why we're here. And in service of our mission, we are grounded in our values. In the State of the District presentation, I must acknowledge that we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and this is certainly where our values are tested. My presentation this evening will center on how we are remaining steadfast to our shared values during this exceedingly challenging time. I want to begin by thanking the Oregon School Board of Education, Oregon School District Board of Education. I really want to take this moment to thank them for their very thoughtful and compassionate leadership during times that are probably more tumultuous than any of us have ever experienced. So we started the school year. And the school year actually began after months and months of planning. Because remember, we were starting for planning multiple scenarios far back in the spring in preparation for what the fall could look like. So you'll see here in the pictures, we started the year where our students in 4K through 8 had Ready, Set, Go conferences, either in person or virtually, to ensure that there was an opportunity to have one-on-one interaction with their teacher. We know there was a supply pickup time for all of our students, but in particular those who were in Oregon Online. And you'll see a picture in the corner of a student beginning his day. And this isn't the way any of us anticipated a year ago that the 2021 school year would start. But we started, and here we go. So our staff have really risen to the occasion. As I mentioned, this isn't where any of us wanted to be. This isn't where we hoped we'd be. But our team had been planning for possibilities for quite a while. And that means that our school teams had been working to plan out for all of the potential possibilities. There was a lot of preparation, and there was a lot of learning on the part of the teachers, because they had to be prepared for multiple eventualities or possibilities, and they had to be prepared to use new formats to make sure that we were finding some consistency and alignment, which we knew from the experiences in the spring were very important to students and families. We also had a huge emphasis on collaboration, and I'll say this again later tonight, but we know we are better together, and because we know that, we know we had to make time in the schedule to allow for teachers to continue to collaborate, to align the experiences, and to have time to talk about the needs of the students and how we were going to meet the needs of every individual child in a situation where it was unusual for all of us. Andy mentioned this earlier tonight, and that is our free meal program. And I want to talk about it in the sense that it's a part of our commitment to our whole child value. And it's an acknowledgement of the role that the schools play in the community. So we know how important it is that we are a place where people can get a meal, right? And so 8,625 meals a week right now are what's being produced by our food service staff, either through pickup twice weekly or delivery twice weekly. So we know that we need to fill many needs within a community, and this is just one of them. Another need that's really critical for schools to fill is ensuring that there are mental health and social emotional learning supports for our students, built into our curriculum and accessible outside of that. Consequently, we're continuing with many of our programs and making significant modifications to ensure that these programs are still accessible to our students despite the circumstances. So Building Bridges is one of the programs that many of you have heard about before, and it's allowing us to supply some pretty significant support for up to 12 families per semester through the partnership of 2 different social workers. We have trauma screeners that we'll continue with in both 6th and 10th grade. And we also know that we're doing a considerable number of student well-being check-ins. And that starts with students that we knew were struggling last spring and continuing the supports now, and also supporting students who are struggling this fall, but perhaps weren't back in the spring. And a lot of this work, in addition to our tremendous student services staff, is also supported by our social emotional learning coaches, and you see them pictured here doing work this summer. In addition to that, we're continuing with our PBIS programming so we have an understanding of what are the expectations as far as how we treat one another, and I'll get to more of that later. But I really wanted to make sure that it was very clear that our values are still driving our actions. We value the whole child, we value equity, and we're making sure that we're continuing and following through on all of the things that continue to be important. And one of the things that unfortunately gets a little lost in the tumultuous times is the celebration of the fact that we opened a beautiful new learning facility for students in grades kindergarten through 6th, and it's through many thanks to the Oregon School District community that we were able to provide this facility for our learners. And one of the best days so far of this school year has been the day that we were able to see little people in our building. Because it was designed for them and for their needs, and being able to watching them experience it was a very special thing. Behind that beautiful building, and buildings can be beautiful, but schools are only as good as the people who are in them, and that's an important thing for all of us to remember. Buildings are terrific, but it's really still a business that's all about the people and the type of connections and relationships that people make. In addition to the building, behind it, there is some lovely land. Actually, the land, in just a couple of days, will become the school forest for the Oregon School District. It isn't just for Forest Edge School, it is for all students in the district. And it's a part of our connection, once again, to our values. It's a part of that meeting the whole child. It's a part of providing relevant and empowering learning experiences, and it's a part of equity, ensuring that all of our students have access to these beautiful outdoor spaces that help them learn. So not only will we be able to offer a school forest experience for our students, but we've also purchased a building directly next door to the forest to allow for an environmental center. So all of the things, all of the features of our beautiful net zero school at Forest Edge, in addition to the solar energy and the geothermal features that are at many of our other schools, all of these pieces are helping our students to understand what it means to live sustainably and to value the environment. I think it's very important to always spend some time talking about this particular value, our focus on equity. Because our values commit us to a safe, healthy, respectful, and equitable learning environment, as does our anti-racist statement that was adopted, or that was put out to families in June, in addition to our anti-hate speech policy that was adopted this summer, and in addition to our long-standing anti-harassment policy. All of these things, in addition to multiple other factors, contribute to our efforts to ensure our students have access to the type of environment that allows them to grow, to thrive, to feel valued, to feel loved. And in this process, in this journey, we have multiple partners. We've started our work with the National Equity Project, and since then, we have also partnered with Nehemiah Center, Critical Consciousness, and several other consultants who have been our wonderful partners along the way. And they've also helped us make improvements to our curriculum to ensure that we are creating inclusive learning spaces and a curriculum that involves multiple perspectives, teaching our young people to be critical thinkers who are looking at all aspects of all situations and really taking a wide viewpoint. And I really can't say enough about our other value, and that is the value of community partnerships. Like, it is through these community partnerships, and I just showed you a couple of examples related to our equity value, but our community partnerships support us in every one of those values. And you can see that the Friends of Oregon School District is an excellent example of a community partnership that allows us to stand by our values and live through our values in service of our kids. Now, whether it is about the snacks we provide during the school day or snacks that Friends of Oregon School District supply, the food packs over long breaks, the Champion Fund grants that allow students to have opportunities that without that fund they may not be able to have, the Cool grants, the mentor program for our students at RCI, and hopefully expanding that to 4th through 9th, and finding ways to connect with kids. So what are our next steps? As a district, our next steps are considerable. And we will continue our efforts to live by our 5 values and to ensure that all decisions we make are based on those values. And we will continue our efforts right alongside using those values to reopen our schools. Our kids need our schools, and we know that. And so we're looking for safe ways to bring them in. Thank you, and now I'll turn it back to meeting chairman, Steve Zak.
Thank you, Dr. Bergson, for your report. The next item on the agenda is old business, and we don't have any old business. So we'll move to new business, and that is the adoption of the tax levy. Motion before you, or the recommendation of the business manager before you, is to adopt a tax levy in the amount of $31,378. I knew I'd get that wrong. You were looking at it. $31,378,799. So that's the recommendation for the tax levy. I need a motion to approve the tax levy in that amount.
So moved.
There's a second.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor of approving the tax levy in that amount signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Levy is adopted. Second item of business is to, no, I went one too far.
There's no slide for the board levy.
There's no slide for that? Okay. The second motion that we need to look at is to adopt the salaries for the school board members for the 2020-2021 school year. The amounts are contained in your orange sheet, and I need a motion to approve the adoption of the board salaries in that amount. Prefer that we don't have a board member. So, Mr. Kleiner with the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Katie Heights with the second. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries.
Mr. Zak, I would make sure the minutes reflect that the board members abstain from that vote.
Yeah. Thank you, Krista. Next motion is to set the meeting date for next year's annual meeting. We recommend the 4th Monday in September at 6:30 p.m. That would make that date September 27th, 2021. I need a motion to set next year's annual meeting.
So moved to schedule the annual meeting for 21 on September 27th, 2021.
Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Weiland with the second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of setting the date of next year's annual meeting on September 27th, 2021, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries. That leaves one more motion for the annual meeting, and that's to adjourn. Mr. Planner with the motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? The annual meeting is adjourned at 7:26. Thanks, everyone, for coming.